That morning, the sky over São Paulo was gray, but there was an almost unsettling peace in Isadora Freitas's heart. She had woken up early, as she always did, to the distant sound of a train and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through her small house behind her grandmother's flower shop. She wore a simple cotton dress, floral like the bouquets she'd lovingly prepared since the age of 10. But this delivery was anything but ordinary. In her hands, she held the week's most important flower order, an exclusive arrangement of white tulips and Colombian roses for a lavish wedding at the Grand Palace Hotel. The address was clear, the time precise. What she didn't know was that destiny, silently, had already made its own arrangements. The lobby of the Grand Palace was a whirlwind. Photographers, wedding planners, makeup artists, and waiters crossed paths in a chaotic symphony of luxury and tension. Isadora entered, clutching her box of flowers to her chest, holding a crumpled slip of paper with the name of the room, Imperial Ballroom B. But in the frantic rush, a distracted security guard pointed to a door on the left and muttered without looking, "Bride, this way. We're late." Before she could protest, she was practically dragged by two women with clipboards. "Finally! You're extremely late!" one of them shouted. And in the blink of an eye, Isadora found herself inside a massive dressing room, lit mirrors, haute couture gowns, and a beauty team descending on her like a storm. I think there's been a mistake," she tried to say, but barely had time to breathe. Hands tugged at her hair, brushed foundation onto her face, and dressed her in a lacy white gown fit for a princess. Her heart pounded. She didn't know whether to scream or flee, but the dress was already zipped up the back, her feet squeezed into heels as tall as her current courage. "Trust it," said one of the makeup artists, smiling as if all of this were normal. She wanted to run, but a door opened and before her lay a long hallway strewn with rose petals. Musicians in tuxedos tuned their violins, and at the end, an altar, packed with people, cameras, and a tall, imposing man in a black suit with icy eyes, waiting, unmoving. The world spun. Isadora's heart pounded in her throat, but something in his gaze froze her in place. A hidden pain, a bruised pride, a look that whispered, "Whoever you are, you're here now, and there's no going back." Pushed gently by the ceremony coordinator, she began to walk, every step a battle between reason and madness. But she couldn't leave. The words, "Do you take her as your lawful wife?" echoed, and for a moment, she looked at him. He nodded. A camera zoomed in, and before she could explain, protest, or escape, her voice came out. Weak, shaky, but it came. "I do." The audience applauded. Subtle fireworks popped outside the windows, and it was there, between fantasy and error, that destiny decided to rewrite their lives. At the end of the ceremony, the kiss was nothing more than a brush of lips. Cold, quick, but enough to seal a contract, not just before the cameras, but before the world. The video went viral in minutes. The mysterious bride of the wedding of the century. Isadora barely had time to grasp what had happened. When she stepped off the altar, desperately seeking an explanation, everything went dark. She fainted, and fell into the arms of the man who, unknowingly, had just become her husband. From that moment on, the twisted fairy tale became a national headline. But the real nightmare, or perhaps the greatest love of her life, was only just beginning. The sound of the heart monitor still beeped softly when Isadora opened her eyes. The white ceiling lights blinded her for a few moments, and everything felt like a distant nightmare, distorted by the delirium of a forced sleep. But it wasn't. When she turned her head, she saw the same imposing figure sitting at the edge of the bed, dressed in a flawless suit, his eyes fixed on her as if analyzing, judging, or perhaps trying to understand who the hell this woman was, who, by fate, or chaos, had just become his wife. "Feeling better?" he asked, voice deep and precise. "Yes, I think she began, but he cut her off. "Good, because we have a contract to sign." Isadora's heart pounded again. This time not with emotion, but with panic. Contract? The word echoed in her mind like a sentence. That's when Lorenzo d'Aquino stood up, pulled a black leather folder from the chair beside him, and placed it on the hospital's bedside table. "You said yes in front of 500 witnesses. You signed with your voice, sealed it with a kiss. And now, the entire country knows you're my wife, and you will be, legally, until this is over." She tried to sit up, but her still weak body didn't respond. "I'm not your wife. I walked into the wrong ceremony. I was dragged in there," she cried, voice trembling. But he didn't even blink. The world doesn't need to know that. Inside the folder was a stack of documents, clauses, terms of cohabitation, public image guidelines, a temporary marriage for convenience, with deadlines, rules, and prohibitions. She would have to take his last name, live in the mansion, follow a schedule of public appearances, and above all, keep the secret. In return, she would receive protection, a generous monthly stipend, and a curious clause. Freedom to leave after 1 year, if everything is kept as agreed. Isadora felt her chest tighten. This is insane. I'm a florist. I don't belong in this world. He approached slowly, eyes locked on hers. You walked onto my altar. Now you'll dance with me until the last song. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Lorenzo's engagement to Marcella, the runaway bride, was more than a romantic arrangement. It was part of a billion-dollar corporate strategy. Marcella's escape at the altar would bring devastating consequences for the D'Aquino Group's public image. But Isadora's entrance, absurd as it was, offered a temporary salvation. And Lorenzo, as controlling as he was proud, wouldn't waste the chance to turn that stroke of chaos into a calculated plan. He needed her, even if he didn't admit it, even if it ate him alive. Faced with pressure, veiled threats, and the fear of being sued for ceremony invasion and public image damage, Isadora gave in. With tears in her eyes, trembling hands, and a shattered heart, she signed the contract, the paper, the sentence. And with that, she sealed not only a legal agreement, but the beginning of a coexistence filled with icy stares, sharp words, and piercing silences. She was taken straight from the hospital bed to a black car with tinted windows, and from there to the D'Aquino mansion, where every room seemed to scream that she didn't belong. The first days were a parade of awkwardness, suspicious employees, cameras in every hallway, public appearances where she had to smile and wave beside a man who barely spoke to her at home. At night, she slept alone in a massive bedroom with silk sheets and pillows that brought no comfort. Lorenzo, for his part, spent hours locked in his office or away on strategic trips. There was no touch, no affection, just a chasm between two worlds, joined by an accident that now felt like a trap set by fate. But in the depths of Lorenzo's gaze, behind the control and the coldness, there was a shadow, a subtle crack that Isadora had started to notice. Something in his silences, his restrained gestures, his way of protecting her even as he threatened her, something revealed that this man wasn't just the villain he appeared to be. And maybe, just maybe, beneath the surface of arrogance and contracts, there was a heart that had once been shattered too many times. The silent war between them was just beginning. Time seemed to stand still inside the D'Aquino mansion. It dragged like an endless winter. The days were marked by a mechanical routine. Breakfast served at 7, endless meetings with advisors in the main hall, silent dinners, and cold nights in separate rooms. Isadora wandered through the house like a gentle ghost, trying to adapt to the suffocating grandeur of those marble walls, golden mirrors, and corridors that seemed to stretch forever. She was a florist surrounded by stone, and the largest block of ice was the very man to whom she was, technically, married. Lorenzo remained unbreakable. His expression never shifted. His voice was measured, and his eyes, however beautiful and hypnotic, revealed nothing but an impenetrable wall. When they crossed paths in the hallways, the most they exchanged were brief nods, as if they were two strangers in a ceremony that had never truly ended. Yet even in that glacial silence, something began to shift. One morning, Isadora wandered to the back of the property, searching for a breath of air, something to remind her of who she was. That's when she found the abandoned greenhouse. Covered in cobwebs, dirty glass, and dried-out pots, the place looked forgotten for years. But as she stepped inside, a wave of feeling washed over her body. It was as if she'd found a capsule of memory in the midst of that empire of stone. She spent the next few days cleaning the space with her own hands. She replanted shoots, rebuilt supports, washed the glass walls, and turned the space into a small, blooming refuge. From the top of the balcony, Lorenzo watched her from afar. At first, he found it ridiculous, but day after day, he began to see that the woman he thought was fragile and lost was rebuilding a piece of life with soil-covered hands and a clean heart. He began to descend into the garden at odd hours, pretending it was coincidence, until one cloudy afternoon, when he saw her trip on a stone and lightly cut her knee, he couldn't help himself. He came closer. "You're going to hurt yourself doing this alone." I know how to take care of flowers. And myself. Not everything that blooms is safe. And not all ice melts with time. The exchange was brief, but sharp. Their eyes locked for seconds that felt like hours. And in that moment, for the first time, he looked away. It was as if her presence had started to pierce through the armor he had so carefully built to shield his wounds. The following night, a storm broke over the city. Lightning danced across the sky like omens of something inevitable. Isadora awoke with a start to a crash from the garden. She ran outside barefoot and saw that the greenhouse had been partially destroyed by a fallen tree. Desperate, she tried to save the plants when she was suddenly pulled back inside by strong arms. It was Lorenzo, soaked, silent, but with fire in his eyes. "You could have gotten hurt. What kind of madness is this?" he shouted, his fingers still gripping her arms. "I took care of that place. It was the only thing here that was mine," she burst out. The silence that followed felt like a breath held for far too long. And then, without warning, without logic, he pulled her in and hugged her. It wasn't a hug of affection, nor of comfort. It was something raw, impulsive, as if he were trying to keep her from vanishing before him. Isadora, frozen in place, felt that this cold, arrogant, methodical man was trembling, just for a few seconds. But he was. He let go quickly afterward, stepping back as if he had made a mistake. Forget it. It was just instinct. And he left, without looking back. But Isadora didn't forget. Because in the midst of chaos, something had begun to bloom. A thread of warmth in the cold. A crack in the control. From that night on, she knew that Lorenzo wasn't just a wounded millionaire. He was a man who, perhaps, had been waiting for someone brave enough to plant something real in the hardened soil he himself had condemned to sterility. And she was willing to try. Behind every intense love story, there's always a shadow that refuses to go away. And in Isadora's case, the shadow wore high heels, imported perfume, and knew exactly where to strike. Marcela Páez hadn't simply vanished at the altar. She had retreated strategically, like someone preparing a counterattack. When she saw her own face on social media beside Isadora's, labeled the replaced bride, something inside her ignited. It wasn't just pride, it was possession. And no man with the last name Aquino would walk out of her life without first being thoroughly ruined, especially if he was beside another woman. The news of Lorenzo's marriage to a nobody florist became meme material, a headline, a scandal. Companies reacted with suspicion, stocks fluctuated on the market, gossip columnists went wild. But the one who cared most about all of it was Marcela. And what she wanted now was to destroy Isadora's image, starting from the roots. Her first strike was quiet, a dossier sent to the press, filled with compromising information about Isadora's past. Old photos, edited videos, and hints that the young woman had purposely infiltrated the wedding to climb the social ladder. "The white dress scam," read the headline on a sensationalist site. Lorenzo remained silent for 2 whole days. He didn't comment, didn't confront, didn't show up. Isadora felt the ground fall beneath her feet. His silence hurt more than any accusation. Did he believe it? Was he regretting it? Sitting alone on the mansion's balcony, she replayed every second of that wedding, every involuntary step that brought her there. She thought of leaving, disappearing, returning to anonymity where no one looked at her like she was an imposter. But in that moment, as the night wind tousled her hair, he appeared. No suit, no CEO stance. Just Lorenzo, in a simple black t-shirt, phone in hand, eyes cold as stone. "You need to see this." He played the video, footage from the greenhouse's security camera, taken days earlier, showing 2 masked men trying to break in. Police had identified one of them as a former employee of Marcela's company. "She tried to sabotage your space and used the media to unnerve you. I won't allow that." It was the first time he publicly took her side. And it wasn't just with words. The next morning, a press conference was called. Lorenzo stood beside Isadora, hand in hand, his gaze unwavering before the reporters. "I married Isadora Freitas, and not by accident. She was a gift from chance, and I don't intend to waste it." Cameras clicked, microphones surged forward, and the tension of an entire nation seemed frozen in that one image. Isadora, nervous, didn't know what to do. But Lorenzo, as if trying to prove to the world, and to himself, that he was the author of his own story, turned to her. "Do you trust me?" She hesitated, but whispered, "Yes." And then he kissed her. This time, there was no contract, no obligation, no game of appearances. It was a real kiss. And though brief, it sealed a new chapter between them. one that had started with resistance, but was now being stitched together by invisible threads. Trust, shared pain, and a spark of something neither of them could name, but both felt growing. Marcella watched the scene unfold on television. From a luxurious apartment in Paris, she gripped her wine glass tightly. Rage burned like acid beneath her skin. She still had cards to play, secrets still buried, and if Lorenzo thought he could replace her that easily, he didn't yet know the true weight of the past. Meanwhile, Isadora and Lorenzo returned home in silence. But this time, something in the air had shifted. A quiet, nearly imperceptible sense of connection, but alive. Like a seed sprouting beneath the soil, quietly, until the day it breaks the surface. In the apparent calm that followed the media storm, Isadora and Lorenzo learned to coexist with less hostility. There was less noise at dinner, less coldness in their exchanged glances, fewer suffocating silences in the mornings they now shared. The kiss in front of the cameras had become a turning point, not because of the headlines it caused, but because of what it awakened. It was as if, for the first time, a gesture had torn through the contract that bound them by obligation, and, with invisible ink, began to draw a new possibility, the chance for something real. But where there's warmth, there's always the threat of combustion. And what neither of them yet knew was that to love someone, one must first confront the secrets that hide in the soul. One lonely afternoon in the mansion's library, Isadora came across a folder tucked between hardbound books. It was an old file, fastened by a leather strap and an aged buckle. Curious, or perhaps just tired of living blindly beside a man who seemed to hide who he really was, she opened it. What she found froze her. Reports, bank statements, signed non-disclosure agreements, and a letter. Addressed to Lorenzo, written by his mother, dated years ago. The words were marked by dried tears. "Son, I hope someday you understand that I didn't run away out of weakness, but to save you." The letter ended abruptly, as if it had been hidden before it could be finished. That night, Lorenzo came home earlier than usual. He found Isadora holding the letter, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You shouldn't go through my things," he said sharply, but there was a tremble in his voice. "You never talk about her, your mother." Lorenzo took a deep breath, removed his jacket, loosened his tie, and sat in front of her like a man stripped of the armor he wore every day. "My mother was the only person who saw something good in me, and even she left me." Isadora didn't say a word. She just listened. It was the first time he had opened up. Lorenzo spoke of being raised between his father's harshness and his mother's absence, of how he grew used to being treated as a piece of the Decino Empire. "Inside here," he said, pointing to his chest, "I have more contracts than emotions." She moved closer, touching his hand gently. "Then why don't you start tearing some of them up?" The next day, it was Isadora's turn to open her own box of secrets. They walked together to the old flower shop, where her grandmother greeted them with a tired smile and eyes full of stories. There, among flower pots and the scent of wet earth, Isadora spoke of her father, a man who promised to return and never did, of a poor childhood, of days selling flowers at the market, and of how she learned that trusting too much meant getting hurt too soon. "That's why I never believed in promises. They hurt more when they're broken." The moment, heavy with truth and memory, tightened an invisible bond between them. They didn't come from the same world, but they carried the same wounds. And it's between scars that, sometimes, the deepest love is born. In the following days, everything changed, subtly. They began sharing breakfast with small talk, brief laughter, glances that spoke louder than words. Lorenzo invited Isadora to accompany him to a gala. For the first time, she chose her dress alone. When he saw her, he didn't hide the impact. "You're impossible to ignore," he whispered. And she, with a faint smile, replied, "Maybe you've only just started to really look." The night was magical. They danced like two strangers rediscovering each other with every step. Isadora allowed herself to rest her head on his chest. Lorenzo held her waist gently, as if she were the balance point between his past and what he now dared to build. But no matter how fast their hearts raced, no matter how the desire burned between them, there was still a wall dividing them. The uncertainty of whether what they felt was real, or just another promise on the verge of being forgotten. And in the silence of the car ride home, as the city slept under the cold glow of streetlights, Lorenzo took Isadora's hand. He said nothing, but in that gesture, there was something no clause in any contract could demand: surrender. Time, now, had begun to play in their favor. But fate's winds, as treacherous as ever, still had plans neither of them dared to imagine. The night of the gala event felt as if it had been stitched together by invisible hands, as though the universe, by some rare whim, had decided to align every detail so that Isadora and Lorenzo could finally see each other, not as a contractual obligation, but as two souls bound by something older and far more uncontrollable, the need to love and be loved. As they entered the ballroom, the world seemed to pause for a moment. The orchestra played softly, crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars, and all eyes turned toward the couple who had until then existed only in headlines. But there, under the gaze of a hypocritical elite and a storm of flashing cameras, they weren't performing. They were living, quietly and honestly, the slow unfolding of a truth that was beginning to loosen the chains of convenience. Lorenzo, dressed in a custom tuxedo, walked with his usual poise. Proud, calculated, in control. But his eyes betrayed a new glint, a flicker of distraction. A subtle hesitation every time Isadora smiled or turned her body slightly to the rhythm of the music. She wore a navy blue dress with a soft neckline, her skin glowing, hair pinned back with delicate flowers, as if she needed to remind herself where she came from. She was impossible to ignore. During dinner, amid glasses of wine, exchanged smiles, and cutting remarks from socialites disguised as friends, Isadora noticed something different in Lorenzo. He wasn't pretending. His compliments were sincere, his gaze intense, and his touch on her back as he guided her across the dance floor made her body forget that all of this had started as an accident. When the music slowed and the lights dimmed softly, Isadora and Lorenzo were alone at the center of the dance floor. The sound of the piano filled the ballroom like a long, deep sigh. He pulled her close by the waist. She rested her cheek on his shoulder. Their bodies molded together like pieces that had never fit so perfectly before. No words were spoken. None were needed. Their hands tightened, eyes closed. And in that danced embrace, there was more truth than in any vow ever spoken at the altar. On the way home, the ride was quiet, but it wasn't the cold silence of before. It was a silence that pulsed, that spoke more than words ever could. Inside the mansion, Isadora hesitated at the top of the stairs. Lorenzo, standing at the final step, watched her like a man battling his own desire. But in that instant, there was no more battle to fight. He stepped down the 2 stairs that separated them, stopped in front of her, and with the softest voice he had ever used, asked, "Would you like to stay tonight?" Isadora didn't answer. She simply nodded, and went up with him. The master bedroom of the mansion was spacious, but that night it felt far too small to hold all that they had both repressed for so long. Lorenzo touched her with reverence, like someone opening an ancient sacred book. His kisses were no longer performative, but filled with hunger and care. Isadora gave herself entirely, her heartbeat pulsing through her lips. Every piece of clothing removed was a piece of armor surrendered. Every touch, an answer to questions they had both long pretended not to ask. The night was long, intense, warm like the whispered words between sheets, and sweet like the relief of 2 bodies finally finding refuge in one another. But as beautiful as the dawn was, it brought with it the weight of questions. Isadora woke up alone. The other side of the bed was already cold. A note on the nightstand read, "Urgent meeting. Back in the afternoon. Take care." Simple, formal, almost indifferent. And it cut through her like a thin blade, as if everything that happened the night before had been a pause, not a turning point. Hours later, she went down to the garden. The greenhouse, which she had rebuilt, was now full of life. But there, among the flowers, a sting of insecurity bloomed inside her. She was falling for a man who could, at any moment, revert to being the distant stranger he had once been. And it was with that thought that she returned to the house, and didn't find him. Lorenzo had left on a last-minute trip to an international meeting in Geneva. No message, no direct word. Isadora once again felt pushed into the role she feared the most, the substitute, a piece in a machine that only turned when it was convenient. A woman who, even after being touched with tenderness, was still treated like a clause in a contract. That night, she slept alone. But what she didn't yet know was that the true earthquake in her life was only just beginning. Silence can be deafening when it follows a moment of intimacy. For Isadora, the days after the night she and Lorenzo finally gave themselves to one another felt like falling into a bottomless well, where the walls were made of doubt and the light of longing. His absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. symbolic, cruel. The unexpected trip, the lack of communication, the unspoken abandonment. She wondered if she had only been a distraction to him, a temporary relief from the weight he carried. Or worse, if she was still, to him, just another pawn in his game of image and reputation. Every hour without an answer turned the mansion into an emotional labyrinth. The staff resumed their polite distance. The cook, who had started smiling at her in the mornings, returned to her restrained gaze. The housekeeper, who had called her Mrs., with tenderness, now referred to her as Miss Isadora, as if sensing the end. Everything around her seemed to be crumbling in slow motion. And then, amidst the emptiness of that house, Isadora gave in to a dangerous impulse. She called her grandmother. Donna Helena answered with her usual soft voice, but something wasn't right. She spoke through coughs, her breath broken. Isadora knew instantly. She had to go back. Within hours, she took a taxi and returned to the village where she had grown up. She left behind only a note for Lorenzo, her handwriting shaky, as if unsure he would even read it. "I'm with my grandmother. She's not well. If you ever want to talk to me, you know where to find me." When she arrived, the simple house was untouched, but the woman who had raised her was far too fragile. Donna Helena had pneumonia, tired, weak. She needed care, rest, love. And without hesitation, Isadora turned the bedroom into a sick room, the kitchen into a tea lab, and the living room into a sanctuary of hope. There, in that silent return to her roots, she found a part of herself she had lost in the mansion. The simplicity, the scent of earth, freshly brewed coffee, neighbors with kind words. But she also rediscovered the ache of not knowing whether she had left behind a love or just a mistake. 3 days later, near sunset, as she collected laundry from the clothesline, a black car pulled up on the dirt road. It was him. Lorenzo stepped out with a hardened face, dark eyes, and deep circles under them. He held a bouquet of flowers, awkward, uneven, almost childlike. "You disappeared," he said. "You left," she replied. And there it was, the rawest form of the abyss between them, their inability to express what they felt without fear of seeming too vulnerable. Lorenzo entered the house, greeted Donna Helena with respect, gently held her hand. But it was when he stepped out into the backyard, and Isadora followed, that the masks began to crumble. "Why did you leave that morning? Why did you treat me like nothing had happened?" she asked, her voice heavy with hurt. Lorenzo took a moment. "Because if I'd stayed, I would have said things I wasn't ready to feel. And now, maybe it's too late." He stepped closer, slowly. "But I came. I'm here. Because even if I don't know how, I know I have to try." His words touched Isadora like a warm wind after days of winter. But before she could respond, his phone rang. He stepped away to answer it. His face changed drastically. "What? When? What do you mean it leaked?" He hung up without another word. "I have to go back to the city. Now." His eyes were pure panic, and in seconds, Isadora understood. Something serious had happened. On the way to the car, he turned back. "Marcella." She struck again. "I don't know how, but she accessed confidential company contracts and is trying to destroy us from the inside." He paused. "Isadora, if anything happens, I want you to know that night was real, and everything I feel for you, even if confused, is truer than anything I've ever lived." Then he left, leaving behind a heart torn between fear and hope. In the early morning, Isadora woke to the sound of sirens in the street. A fire had started in the back of her grandmother's flower shop. Tall flames consumed greenhouses, tools, and memories. Neighbors helped with buckets of water, but it was impossible to contain. When the fire was finally extinguished, the smell of smoke still clung to everything, and on the ground, among the ashes, Isadora found a metallic object that didn't belong there. A lighter, discreetly engraved with the initials MP, Marcella Pius. The abyss was no longer made only of silence, but of threats. The past was burning down everything she was trying to rebuild, and the future had never been more unstable. The flames that consumed the flower shop left behind far more than ashes and soot. They tore open a wound in Isadora's past, a deep cut through the memory of everything she had been before Lorenzo. And though the firefighters confirmed there were no victims, the sense of mourning was inescapable. Buried in that scorched earth were not just flowers, but the roots of her childhood, her grandmother's labor, the dreams of a little girl stitched together between petals and thorns. The flower shop was more than a place. It was Isadora's heart, laid bare to fire, and now, shattered. Lorenzo arrived in the village the next day, like a storm that finally understood it had destroyed more than it could fix. When he saw Isadora's face covered in soot, her hands bandaged, and her eyes devoid of light, he realized something had broken between them. Not with shouting, but with his absence at the most crucial moment. "I should have stayed. I should have protected you," he said, but his words felt too late. She didn't reply. She only looked at him as if, for the first time, she truly saw the emptiness between promises and reality. It was then that Lorenzo made the decision that would change everything. He would step away, temporarily, from his company, his commitments, even his reputation. He would return to the village. He would help rebuild what had been lost, with his own hands, if needed. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo Antunes d'Aquino chose love over control. And as absurd as that seemed to shareholders and business columnists, it was met with silent respect by the humble people of the village. For weeks, he and Isadora worked side by side, raising the structure of what had once housed flowers, and now would hold something even greater. The idea came from her, but he made it real, building a school of gardening and floral design for underprivileged youth in the community. A center for learning, art, and healing, where nature would not just be scenery, but the main character. With each brick laid, each seed planted, they were learning again how to trust, to laugh, to touch. Donna Helena, now recovering, watched it all with misty eyes and clasped hands. "Sometimes, love needs a tragedy to truly bloom," she told Isadora, as she watered the first replanted sprouts. Isadora smiled, but that smile held more than joy. It held a secret. She was pregnant. She had found out days earlier, alone, in silence, holding a test bought discreetly at the village pharmacy. The positive result wasn't a shock. It was a wave, strong, overwhelming, but also peaceful. She didn't yet know how to tell Lorenzo. She was afraid. Afraid he'd see it as a burden, a consequence, a trap. But deep down, she also knew it was the most unexpected miracle of her life. One autumn afternoon, seated on a wooden bench under the shade of a jabuticaba tree, Isadora almost told him, "Lorenzo, there's something I need to tell you." But she was interrupted by an urgent call, a crisis at the company, leaked documents, falling shares, a revolt among shareholders, and the name behind it all, Marcela Paez. He had to leave that night. There was no time for talks, no goodbyes, only a lingering kiss, a touch on her face, and a promise. "I'll be back in 3 days, I swear." But for Isadora, the word promise had already left too many scars. And so it was alone, days later, that she attended her first prenatal appointment. Alone, she held the envelope containing the baby's heartbeat. Alone, she smiled and cried at the same time. And in the silence of the village, with the garden center finally inaugurated and children learning to plant in colorful little pots, she felt she had created something that no vengeance could erase. The child she carried was more than a bond between two worlds. It was the seed of something Lorenzo had never imagined. A future rooted in love, not contract. In surrender, not control. In truth, not facade. But fate, as always, still had seeds of its own to scatter. And not all of them bloom under sunlight. What Isadora feared most came to pass with the chill of an unexpected winter. Lorenzo found out about the pregnancy, in the worst way possible. Not through her lips, not in an intimate moment or a shared glance while listening to the baby's heartbeat, but through a sensationalist tabloid headline. On the cover, in bold capital letters, "The florist is pregnant. Is the baby the millionaire's or someone else's?" And below, a series of hidden photos. Isadora leaving the clinic, exam envelope in hand, her expression tense and worn, carrying the weight of 2 lives, her own and the silent one growing inside her. Lorenzo saw the news from his office, surrounded by advisors, lawyers, and board members. The discomfort was absolute. None of them dared say a word. He simply stood, stared at the computer screen, and walked out with slow, heavy steps filled with restrained fury. Inside him, a storm brewed. Betrayal, disbelief, wounded pride. Not because of the pregnancy, but because she hadn't told him. Because she'd hidden it. Because she let the world know before he did. And worse, because it meant that maybe she didn't trust him. That maybe, deep down, she still saw him as a man who would run the moment he saw vulnerability. He took the first flight to the village without notice, his heart racing like never before. When he arrived, he found Isadora in the garden at the gardening center, helping a child plant seeds in a small pot. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile faded the moment she recognized the tension in his face. "You could have told me," he said. No anger, no yelling, but with the kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than any accusation. "I was going to, Lorenzo. I just didn't know how. I was afraid of your reaction, your silence, your absence." He took a deep breath. "You judged me before giving me a chance to be something more." Isadora held back the tears, but her eyes were already brimming. "I didn't want this to be just another clause in our contract. I wanted it to be love." And in that moment, both of them realized a painful truth. The love blooming between them was strong enough to make them want to stay, but still too fragile to survive the wounds each carried. The conversation didn't last. They were tired, hurt. Lorenzo left the same day. No kisses, no promises, no glance over his shoulder. Isadora remained, her belly growing with each passing day, and her heart shrinking under the weight of a prideful man she was, at last, truly beginning to love. News of the pregnancy spread like wildfire. Social media divided. Some defended her fiercely, praising her strength and courage. Others, fed by rumors planted by Marcella herself, accused her of opportunism, of having planned everything to trap a millionaire. And Lorenzo, overwhelmed by the media pressure and the demands of his investors, chose to stay silent. He didn't confirm. He didn't deny. Isadora, for her part, decided she would not beg for love. She would carry the pregnancy with dignity, with the support of her grandmother, the villagers, and the now flourishing gardening center, an oasis in the midst of chaos. Every night she spoke to the baby, seated on the same wooden bench where Lorenzo had once promised he would return. "You will grow up surrounded by love, even if for now it's only mine," she whispered, caressing her belly with tenderness and strength. But deep down, she still waited for him, because no matter how loudly pride shouted inside her, love whispered louder. She knew Lorenzo wasn't just the man who had hurt her with silence. He was also the man who saved her from emptiness, who rebuilt the flower shop with her, who held her hand without words when everything seemed to fall apart. And maybe, just maybe, he was still the man capable of surprising her. Time passed. Her belly grew, and the day of the birth arrived on a stormy dawn. Isadora was rushed to the hospital in the nearest town, with Donna Helena by her side, gripping her hand and repeating with faith, "Everything will be fine, my girl." The baby was born strong, healthy, a boy with eyes dark as night and hands restless like fate. And when Isadora opened her eyes, exhausted but whole, the first thing she saw was Lorenzo, standing in the doorway of the room, eyes red, unshaven, suit wrinkled, and a flower in hand. A blue flower, just like the one she wore in her hair on the day of their first kiss. There was something symbolic in the way Lorenzo entered that room. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, didn't wait for permission. He simply appeared, like someone who no longer had time to lose, like someone who had finally understood that there are moments when silence wounds more than any word, but that a gesture, however simple, can stitch back together what once seemed irreparably broken. In his hand, he held the same blue flower he had once seen tucked into Isadora's hair, on the night their hearts began to beat out of sync, and yet perfectly in tune. Isadora, still pale, still fragile, looked at him as if seeing a ghost with eyes silently pleading for forgiveness. He didn't speak. He walked to the crib, looked at the tiny one wrapped in light blankets, and touched the tip of his fingers with a tenderness that contradicted every wall he had spent a lifetime building. Tears fell down his face. Not discreet, not restrained, but raw, honest. He wept not from shock or emotion, but from the regret of letting time pass between them like a merciless judge. "I was a coward," he finally said, voice trembling, shoulders hunched. "A coward for not knowing how to handle love, for not trusting you when it mattered most, for letting my pride shout louder than what my heart whispered every time I saw you. I pushed you away. I judged you. And still, you gave me the greatest gift of my life." Isadora didn't answer right away. She looked at the baby, took a deep breath. Her body still ached, but her soul, in that moment, began to heal. "You left when I needed you most. You left me alone. And when you came back, you still weren't ready." She looked at him, steady. "Do you only show up when the world collapses?" Lorenzo stepped closer to the bed. He knelt down, took her hand gently. "No. I show up now because, for the first time in my life, I know exactly where I want to be, and who I want to be. Isadora, I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to make a new vow." And there, on his knees, her hand in his, he began to speak. There was no priest, no altar, no audience. But each word sounded holier than all the vows exchanged in that forced wedding months ago. I promise to be present, even on days when I don't know what to say. I promise to protect you and our son with all that I am, even when I'm afraid. I promise to listen more than I speak, to hold more than I demand, and to love, even when the world tries to pull us apart. I don't want to live by contract anymore. I want to live by choice. And I choose you. Every day. From this day on. Forever. Isadora cried. Not in desperation, but in relief. Because finally, the man before her was no longer the arrogant CEO, the lonely heir, the untouchable millionaire. He was simply Lorenzo, father of her child, love of her life, and for the first time, he was real. She pulled him close, touched his face with the same tenderness one uses to touch a flower just beginning to bloom. Then promise you'll stay. I promise. No contracts, no contracts. No running, no running. Then kiss me, like it's the last time. No, like it's the first of all the times still to come. And he kissed her. Days later, in an intimate ceremony in the rebuilt garden of the flower shop, surrounded by friends from the village, by the children from the gardening center, and by Donna Helena smiling through tears, they married again. But this time, not by mistake, not by contract, not by obligation, but by love. And when they exchanged vows, handwritten, simple, and filled with truth, a butterfly landed on Isadora's shoulder. The sky was clear. Time, at last, was on their side. And the past, no matter how painful, was now just fertilizer for the future they chose to plant. A future where a mistake became a miracle, and where a wrong wedding became the most right of destinies.